welcome back to another episode of the DD Geopolitics Podcast. I'm Sarah, joined by JM, and our special guest today is Shabbir Rizvi. He's a political analyst specializing in U.S. and foreign and domestic policy, geopolitics, and military science. He writes for PressTV and Al Mayadeen. He is a whole milk enthusiast and world's best kitten father. JM, you have competitions. Shabbir, welcome to the show. How are you?
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you for having me. I'm doing well. Whole milk and Bang Energy, if I could give a quick shout out.
Do not mix the two, please.
Do not mix the two. No.
JM, how are you? It's been a while.
Good morning, since that's now my name, GM.
GM, the top GM, top GM. Anyway, so we're going to talk about Iran today. Iran's revolutionary march to the global stage, like Iran taking on a leadership position, totally emerging out from isolation, and maybe even being an inspiration for other isolated states such as North Korea. So what did you think of Ibrahim Raisi's speech at the UN? Because I know that most of my Muslim friends were like, yes. But I really wanted to get you, because I know you like to analyze stuff like that. So how did it feel? What did you think?
Yeah, short answer. Fantastic speech. I would argue it's the best one, but I think we have to really take into a lot of variables here around the speech, right? Let's actually start off with my favorite one, is that the Zionist envoy got booted out like immediately. Like, actually the best part about that was, for the uninitiated, like this Israeli envoy held up like this woman life freedom sign while President Raisi was speaking, and like no one cared. Like no one cared at all. This guy was holding up this sign, which I think is hypocritical of itself, because as he's holding up this sign that says, like, I don't even know what it said. It just had something to do with that women life, whatever movement, right? I'm not even going to give it, the respect and that name that it deserves. Like Israel, this month was like strip searching people, right? It's shot journalists. It's killed like, women journalists. It's killed like women nurses that are on the battlefield, like, escorting civilians out of like a war zone. And so just like the hypocrisy of that is really interesting to me. And at the same time, like nobody cared, right? You would think that, a country that was previously, as isolated as Iran was, that, the Zionists would at least, reach out to their neighbors or like, their allies or associates and be like, hey, we're going to pull this really cringe stunt. You want to join us? And you know what? No one did. Even if they asked, it seems that no one did. If you look very closely at that video, maybe like two people turn around and they immediately just turned right back to President Raisi. And then just to get into the content of the speech, right? I think first and foremost, what I think billions, I will say, across the world can agree upon is, the defense of the Quran itself. He held up the Holy Quran. He read a poem about it in recent months. For the people that haven't been, keeping up, there's been Quran desecrations across Western Europe. You'd think they would worry about energy prices or things like that, because, essentially Europe is sanctioning itself to death on behalf of the United States. But no, it seems like they want to burn the Quran. The Quran gives me a sense of warmth in my heart. If they're trying to burn it to keep themselves, actually physically warm, I would say stop sanctioning Russia, but that's a whole beast of its own. And then finally, if you can just let me go on for just a minute longer, I think yesterday really encapsulates the last year, because just a year ago, right? Western media, all cameras on Iran, the woman life freedom or whatever movement, started off, the foreign plots, there were riots on the streets, things like that. And so everybody was saying, at least like this Twitter army, right, was essentially saying that this is the end of the Islamic Republic of Iran. This was quite a year, 365 days ahead. There was a lot that we're going to get into, I'm sure. But all this to say, whoever was plotting against this Iran yesterday marks their loss. They lost. There was warm greetings for President Raisi. He came out victorious. Everybody that had worked to overthrow, the Islamic Republic of Iran got slapped across the face with all five fingers.
He addressed so many issues in yesterday's speech. He addressed the burning of the Quran, which was amazing because, and a lot of people say, oh, well, it does burn, but I think that the best thing about it is that Islam tells you to memorize the Quran. So the saying is you could destroy all the Qurans in the world, and a couple hours later there would be a new one. So there's no getting rid of the Quran. He addressed women's incarceration in the. Sorry, my dog is having a blast. He addressed women's incarceration in the United States. He addressed nuclear power. He addressed quite a few things. And watching the Israeli ambassador being escorted out was just like, wow, maybe it is a new world. Maybe it is different, because everybody said when the BRICS summit happened that, everybody makes fun of BRICS. BRICS is a joke. And then you see things like this and you're like, maybe the world is changing a little bit, because Israel is a very prominent player at the UN, and usually they could get away with this crap. So I'm pretty impressed with how yesterday went. And wow, since we're on the topic, how do you feel about Iran joining BRICS and immediately becoming a key player through basically oil bartering?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I'm enthusiastic about it. I think I was listening to this very podcast where I think Iran was your top choice. I think someone else said Syria. I was actually banking on either one of those two. I think Syria is down the line, but all this to say about Iran, I thought it was the natural choice for many reasons. So one, there's the north-south corridor that facilitates billions to, potentially trillions worth of, resources and revenue for the region. Right. So Iran's already a key player in that. You can't not go through Iran there. Two, earlier this year, they joined the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which, already has, Russia and China as key players in there. And so with that being said, I thought when that moment happened, then it's going to be extremely obvious that they're going to join BRICS. And then the final nail in the head, I think, was when India, right? India really doesn't really need to say anything about Iran. There's really no choice, right? But I mean, there's really no reason for India to really speak on Iran, but India really went out of its way to say, we think Iran should be part of BRICS. We're going to do everything that we can to make sure that they join BRICS. And I think all this to say, Iran has really proved itself to be a key player, because if you take a look at, the last 20 years, during the so-called war on terror, because I think that's the backdrop of, what's happening in the region, Iran survived a lot. It survived crippling sanctions for decades on end, but then also survived terror plots. It survived Mossad assassinations. There was the falling out of the JCPOA. There was a maximum pressure sanctions rather under the Trump administration. There was the assassination of General Soleimani, where the United States was basically saying, we're not going to let your influence bleed out into the region. But despite all of that, Iran played its cards right, despite having all these odds stacked against it. And I think, key players like, China, India, Brazil, Russia really saw that despite all of this that's happening, Iran is dodging all these sanctions. It's, charging right ahead. It's facilitating not only, the trade of oil, but other, key exports. And all the while, it's surviving all these, assassination attempts, all these overthrows, all this regime change stuff. And all the while, even on top of that, it's assisting what we call, the axis of resistance, right? It's helping the Syrian Arab army fight, not only ISIS, but also American influence in the region. It's helping out Hezbollah in Lebanon. It's helping out the Palestinian resistance. It's even helping out Ansar Allah in Yemen. It's helped create the popular mobilization forces in Iraq. So, it's dodging sanctions. It's trudging on ahead economically. It's a military powerhouse on record. The Iranian defense ministers can say, oh, well, we never, gave the Shahed drones to Russia. We're not supplying them, but, hint, hint, wink, wink, right?
Well, yeah. And I mean, I was the one who said Syria. That was my dream entry into BRICS, but we need Iran in order to get to the Levant. And I think that's why, the entry of Iran was so strategic, and for fear of maybe going out on a limb, it kind of balances out the entry of Saudi and the entry of UAE. So to me, and I might be speaking out of turn, Saudi and the Gulf states don't function the same way as the Levant and Iran. I feel like Iran has a stronger connection to the Levant and Yemen. And I think that this was a good counterbalance to that. And it starts to bring Saudi Arabia out of the Western sphere of influence and into the Arab League as another key player. So now we see Iran emerging and Saudi Arabia both emerging as the two key players in the Arab League, but they're kind of opposite poles without being in active conflict. So I think it was a decent counterbalance. And I am daring to say, maybe JM, you agree, but I think that the Iran coming out of isolation and joining BRICS has sent a signal to other countries such as DPRK, Cuba, maybe some of the more of the global South, and even some of Africa, to start saying, hey, we might be sanctioned to death, but it doesn't have to be this way.
Or even rather than it doesn't matter, because there's this whole idea that I think the West still has, which is very strange to have, I think, in this era, which is that we're in any sense the world. It's not 1900 anymore, where 1/3 of the population of this planet Earth lives in North America and in Europe. That just isn't how the world works anymore, and it's especially not the world of 1900, where almost all of the economic activity, industrial production, financial services that you could find on this planet Earth, and being able to do that was concentrated in that golden sector of the North Atlantic, stretching approximately, from, shall we say, Chicago to St. Petersburg. It's not that world anymore. It's in that sense, that the West is just a very, very important part, but nonetheless just a part of this broader world. It cannot claim to be, the world. So when it says Russia is isolated from the rest of the world, I think you need to first ask India and China about that, not just because of how many people there are there, but also because of now the economic importance and sophistication of those countries. I mean, after all, India just landed on the moon. And both Russia and the United States find it difficult, and China itself finds that difficult, but India managed it. And as we've seen over the past 8 years, that yes, Iran is both determined, but also very sophisticated, and also, I think, something of a subtle actor. Let me put it this way. Despite some rather unfortunate mishaps with what Quds Force did with anti-air missiles to an airliner, nonetheless, the Iranians showed incredible restraint, given that they had just suffered an act of war by the killing of a major general. I think that was both his rank and the fact that he was a very important general, because the equivalent would have been if someone had assassinated the U.S. commander of Special Operations Command. Can you imagine what the United States would do if suddenly a state actor openly boasted about murdering the head of Special Operations Command? The United States would have said, very well then, I declare war. Iran, however, showed incredible restraint in what must have been incredibly hard, not just within the circles of power, but in broader society, to show such restraint. It shows a great maturity and a great sense of state.
Not only that, but their advancements in so many sectors has been incredible, but we have to focus on women's rights and clothing in the West. Iran has one of the best plastic surgery programs in the world. They have the best drone program in the world. They can't even keep up with orders anymore. They just built a drone carrier, but we have to shun them because human rights. I'm not. That's what we're focused on. So it's just kind of like anything that we can do to bastardize or demonize the Islamic Republic is what's going to happen in the West.
Let me just say really quickly, I think you made a great point there, JM or GM, whichever you prefer. I'll respect both. When it comes to, I think you made a great point there about the Quds Force. And I think that's just actually a testament to, Iran's security in general, because one thing Iran can do that I think no other nation can really keep up with, outside of maybe, I guess, China, right? Is that they can play their cards right, and they'll play them patiently. Because time and time we see again, like these nations, like, the United States, for example, or its allies like, Azerbaijan, or even in that context anyway, and Israel, constantly trying to pester Iran and trying to get them into this, this conventional warfare scenario that's going to be dragged out. It's going to be used against Iran. And then in the meantime, they're really banking on something internal happening in Iran, kind of like the riots last year, to really finish off Iran's government. And I think Iran has always played its cards very carefully, especially with exactly what you said, the assassination of General Soleimani, where they had very targeted strikes, right? But that is to say, they still are saying that they're not through with their revenge. And I think that's way more important to play the long-term game and keep bringing it up until they declare real justice has been achieved. Because if they do go into a full flat-out war scenario, right, and they don't have their cards right, and they're not prepared, right, that could result in the entire collapse of the region. That's exactly what the United States wants. It wants Iran to play into the scenario where they can then use whatever they want to declare, a conventional war scenario. And then that spells out the axis of a resistance, right? The whole thing falls apart. A large swaths of the resistance factions do rely on, Iranian weapons. They rely on Iranian intelligence and logistics. And so Iran has to really play its cards right, because, Iran's ideology very much motivates the resistance in and within that region. But also, just to go back to playing its cards right, I think the great example of that, how it plays that out, domestically, are these riots, right? Because if you recall the riots last year, they went on for quite some time, didn't they? I think they pretty much culminated at the end of, that horrific mosque shooting at the shrine. I can't recall the name of the shrine right now, but essentially ISIS entered and they shot up a bunch of people, and it was horrific. But then those riots culminated, right? It was done. There were very few, people actually partaking in them. And I think it's actually pretty smart, right? Because Iran saw this event occurring. It saw swaths of people on the streets, not quite, millions, but definitely like, a few thousand in total, right? And what did it do? Just kind of let it play out, right? Of course, the security forces were deployed. Of course, they were quelled. They were using paintball guns, which I think is a huge testament to how Iran treats its own citizens in respect to the United States, where, I was very much part of the George Floyd uprising. We had, cops with live ammunition there ready to, open fire at any time. I remember that very specifically. And so, all this to say, in the meantime, while these riots are happening, right, these people are clearly being funded by someone, right? The tactics that they're using are the same kind of tactics that we saw with, like, the Hong Kong rioters, right? And we all know the CIA's hands were all over that. So what did the intelligence services do? They just waited and they tried to find the exact source of this, right? Because this is a good opportunity for whoever is a bad character in Iran to really reveal themselves, right? And they took this opportunity, they found the source, and, they arrested a bunch of people. No one's denying that, thousands of people were arrested. But if you actually look at what happened later down the line, which is what, Western media does not like to admit, I believe it was at the start of this year. I believe the occasion was Eid, actually, where Ayatollah Khomeini pardoned thousands of people at the same time. He pardoned thousands of them. Can you imagine that happening in the United States, where thousands of people are just like, hey, you can leave. It's only been a few months. Sorry about that. You're gone. Just don't do that again, right? And they can do that with exact certainty. They can let people leave with exact certainty because the source has been taken care of. If they were economically motivated, great. Now you're not going to get paid. Go back and get a real job, loser, right? If they were ideologically motivated, they probably are still in prison, right? Or maybe they're let back into a society that now understands that this person is a bad actor. Let's keep an eye on them. But, you don't really see these riots, a year later, right? On the anniversary, a lot of people were probably expecting, something to break out. There are maybe like 12 bourgeois kids in some street corner in Tehran that are, and they're probably like the sons and daughters of like foreign ambassadors that are doing this anyway. So who cares, right? But I think, Iran can act in full confidence right now because whatever was there, whatever, foreign assets were there have been taken care of. They're in jail or somewhere worse, I hope, personally. And then you also see kind of like, where they were receiving arms shipments, right? So I think there's two key areas where, there was, the protesters or rioters rather were able to find weapons, right? And start shooting at security forces. There were two main areas. So one would be Balochistan, just near the Pakistan border. and one would be Kurdistan, which is near, the Iraq border. As we speak right now.
Are you taking the words out of my mouth? I was just about to say, let's get spicy. Let's talk about the Kurds. But yeah,
exactly. As we speak right now, actually, Iran's not even doing this. They told Iraq, hey, you have a Kurd problem at your border. If you don't take care of it right now, we're going to take care of it for you, right? And, I'm obviously not grouping all Kurds into one thing because that's horrifically terrible and racist. All I'm saying is that there's a lot of Kurdish separatists that actually had a hand in these internal riots that were happening. They were actively arming them. And so Iran is actually flexing, I think, its geopolitical muscles right now by saying, take care of this, Iraq. We know that you have some influence within your parliament. That's U.S. installed influence. We're going to let you take care of it. Otherwise, we're going to take care of it for you, right? And then the same thing kind of in Balochistan, where it's pressuring the Pakistani government like, hey, you have a serious terrorist problem on this border. It's actually not even impacting us. It's impacting you because these are the same terrorists that are responsible for, actually blowing up some of the projects that China had with Pakistan that were set to bring in, millions of dollars worth of revenue. So there's actually a mix of like standard Al-Qaeda people combined with the East Turkestan movement, which is, the Uyghur separatists that are in the Xinjiang region. So there's a whole slew of bad actors completely surrounding Iran. And so Iran has to, again, play its cards right, and it's played them patiently and it's played them correctly. And as we saw yesterday, it has paid off.
Is this current situation improving the relations between Iraq and Iran? Because obviously we know that they've not always been the best, but are they improving now that, because I know Iraq works pretty closely with Syria, and I always look at Iran as like kind of like the guardian of Syria in a way. But are the ties between, also Pakistan has always had a terrorist problem, but is this strengthening the relationship between Iran and Iraq, or is this more cause for strife?
I think within most swaths of Iraqi people, I think it's strengthening the relations. I think a good, event to point to is 2 weeks ago, which is the event of Arba'in, which is where, millions of pilgrims go into Karbala, which is this holy city in Iraq. And you can see the kind of like, the border movements between Iran and Iraq, which are, guarded by both Iraqi and Iranian security forces. And it went off pretty much without an incident. The one thing that did happen, though, that I do want to comment on is a Kurdish leader, I forgot his name. Actually, his supporters started to kind of riot in the Kurdish regions. And Iraqi special operations forces actually had to be deployed there to quell that. I think that just goes to show where Iraqi people kind of stand when it comes to who would they rather prefer as their ally. Would it be, the Kurdish region that's always kind of, starting riots or like, these uprisings at very unwelcome times, or is it going to be the Iranians who they actually, a lot of the Iraqis are Shia Muslim, as you know, and Iran is, Shia Muslim. I think they would rather, have a Shia Muslim on their side than someone that, in Syria, for example, is very much openly siding with the United States. And we all know the horrific things that the United States did in Iraq.
Oh, yes. I just wanted to say, by the way, that in terms of the Kurds themselves, I think, if you don't mind, I'm going to quote from one of the books by former Russian Prime Minister Yevgeny Primakov about the development of the relationship with the Kurds and how Barzani, back in the early 70s, phrased it when Primakov was complaining to him that he was while also seeking money from the Soviet Union, was developing ties with the United States and was also reaching out to Israel and also trying to deal with the Iranian government against Saddam and also trying to deal with Saddam. And this was his response. I knocked on one door asking for bread and was turned away, i.e. from Saddam. What am I supposed to do? Starve to death? So I knocked on another door. Who's to blame, me or the one that turned me away? So it just kind of shows there that I think what seems to be happening in up there is that some of this sort of dealing is this juggling act is starting to fail. This very dangerous juggling act, because they tend to play with high explosives.
Yeah, and then it's ultimately going to lead you to be surrounded by enemies, right? That it's actually you at fault here.
Let's talk about the recent release of the funds to Iran. Most of the Iranians that I know are celebrating it as a victory. I look at it as a victory, but why don't you, for our listeners, kind of explain the exchange and the dynamics of it?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's business as usual, freezing Iran's assets for the United States. It's very hard to get this sort of stuff back. Usually there's some sort of major concession from Iran's side. Usually it has to do with nuclear. This time, not very, like pretty much very different, right? Because, there's a lot that one can say was exchanged in terms of American prisoners that were it was said that they were spies. I don't really know too much if they were spies or not. And one can go back and forth about that for both, sets of prisoners, right? Because, there's a lot to say there. But I think it's a huge political victory that right now, right? Like right now, as we speak, that $6 billion was unfrozen, right? Because as America is trying to sanction Iran, they're giving them $6 billion, right? So America is clearly admitting that, there's a concession here. They're trying to kind of create the smokescreen here, oh, we're sanctioning Iran. Look at the sanctions. Don't look at the fact that we unfroze $6 billion on actually 9/11. A lot of racist Americans want to equate Iran with 9/11 because it goes to the war on terror. I'm like, no, actually, Osama bin Laden was your guy. But I'll just say,
don't give him he was the Saudis guy. He was the Saudis. He was ours and the Saudis. Okay.
Yeah, we'll give him that. He was a Saudis guy, but the Soviet war in Afghanistan, all that stuff. We can go back and forth about that. But I think right now what's happening is really funny because Iran's on its way to the UN as it's being unfrozen. It's also on the exact anniversary of the Women Life Freedom riots, and so you had this major lobbying and all this political rah-rahing in Washington a year ago that's saying, hey, do something about Iran, act on Iran, sanction them, starve them, do whatever. A year later, how about we just release $6 billion of their dollars? I think it's also worth paying attention to some of the political framing about it at home, because a lot of politicians are taking to Twitter or taking to their statements and saying, we gave Iran $6 billion. You didn't give Iran anything. You unfroze their money. Americans are pissed that they think that taxpayer dollars are going to Ayatollah Khamenei's pocket. So
we earned money. We kept the interest.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. I think that's a very key point about that because as you withhold that money has to go somewhere. But besides that point as well, if Americans want to be pissed about their money being used for something stupid, I don't know. Look at Zelensky.
No. We can't. No.
$100 billion plus in U.S. taxpayer money, and I don't
know if you saw the ticker, but they just gave another $325 million just about 10 minutes ago.
It's ridiculous. No money is enough for that guy's nostrils. It's ridiculous.
Jesus. We're getting canceled.
I do have to ask two questions. So the first is, why do you think that the United States kept freezing the money even after these assets, even after sanctions were over, even after they twisted Iran's arm quite successfully into signing the JCPOA, but they then just flipped over the table? And the more minor question, how did you feel about the fact that all of a sudden at a lot of these protests, imperial flags started appearing everywhere?
Let me start off with the latter one first, because I'm going to swear here, but I fucking hate the Shah. Let me actually just give you a bit of history and how these these monarchists fly this flag, right? Because they like to frame Iran as this progressive society before 1979, and the only pictures they have of it are 1970s and 1960s Tehran, and they have all these actresses there. Okay, let's look at any other city besides Tehran, right? Tehran's a bourgeois capital of imperial Iran, where all these Hollywood celebrities are flying in. They have the bankers there, they have the oil executives there, they have the entire royal family there. Okay, let's look at Bandar Abbas, let's look at Home, let's look at Shiraz, let's look at literally any other city. And what you have is the Shah's secret police, breaking up majlis, which are basically religious gatherings, right? They're breaking up Friday prayer, they're torturing people to death. There's poverty, rampant poverty everywhere. And either these people are completely ignorant or oblivious, or they are the most racist, maniacal, evil pieces of shit in the world. Take your pick, right? So I personally, I see the monarchist flag, and I either think, okay, this is just an historical relic in like, one context, or if it's in a context where it's being thrown in my face, like what the hell is wrong with you, right? These are like completely like essentially just British assets at that moment in time, right? So I don't like that at all.
Can I ask a question about the monarchists? Because I was holding a space with a couple of Iranians. They were IRGC, or they support the Iranian state. And then, of course, we had gotten some infiltrators, which I love a good infiltrator, but they got to like teach me something. So these people were, I don't even believe that they were Iranian, but I think they were. But they came in and they were like, we want the Shah back, and Iran can help Israel. And if Israel and Iran can make peace, then like that's like the ultimate goal here. And they all lived in the West. They were either in Australia or the United States. As I was calling them the Shahs of Sunset, because they all live in like California or on the Gold Coast of Australia. And it was just the strangest thing that they were like, we are Iranian Zionists. And I was like, that doesn't even like compute in my brain. So I was like, are these just like agent provocateurs that are actually just Zionists and are pretending to be Iranian? And if so, they're not very good at their job. So I've never understood that kind of like we can juxtapose Iran and the Israeli state. It just doesn't like make sense to me. So I was like, why is this even like a thing?
My maybe controversial answer is going to be, in every revolution, some people are rightfully kicked out. And those people, and whatever lineage they came from, were probably rightfully kicked out because they were maybe collaborators, maybe they were traitors. But as it turns out, most importantly, they support an apartheid occupation regime.
Is there a word for gusano in Farsi?
Monothathin, which basically means hypocrites.
Okay.
It's actually a surah in the Quran. But all this to say, I mean, even like, the Cubans kicked out, what we call gusanos, even the Soviets kicked out Trotsky. Every revolution has its traitors. And I think what you can encounter were authentic Iranians, but authentic in the sense that they were, loyal to the Shah. They were loyal to the Western project. They were loyal to colonialism. They were okay with their country being essentially a puppet state for the West, which includes, at that time, primarily England, but it would eventually, of course, be, the United States. And so those people were completely content. They are probably the most proponent supporters of the Women, Life, Freedom riots because they believe in Western liberalization of the entire land, right? To them, the Iranian woman is oppressed because they can't view her, they can't subject her to, their, probably hypersexualized thoughts. These are people that believe that if you cannot be an object to them, then they'll get mad about it and they'll kick and scream about it. So their entire framing of things is from an angle that, says that Western liberalism is correct. The rest of the world needs to get in line and quote unquote advance. And most Iranians don't agree with that.
Exactly. It's just more woke imperialism. And we're going to get into what I really have questions about. I think JM will too. Armenia and Azerbaijan. Iran has now taken on a negotiator role where Russia didn't. That's kind of neat. I kind of thought maybe JM, you might agree, or you can at least elaborate. I kind of thought Russia allowed that to happen. Not that they're allowing, not that Iran has to ask permission, but the fact that Iran did take on a little bit of a mediator role, and Russia kind of said, okay, let's let Iran handle it. We have Azerbaijan, who is a majority, they're secular as a state, but it's a majority Muslim country. And then you have an Orthodox Armenian country, and Iran backs Armenia, but utilizing its common ground of Islam to also negotiate with Azerbaijan. Is that, and what's the relationship there between Iran and Armenia? I know that for our listeners, Azerbaijan is mostly backed by Turkey and Israel, so it would make it a natural proxy enemy to Iran. But just surprising to see Iran has backed Armenia and is now kind of like, okay, the government in Armenia doesn't really make a lot of sense, so we can like maybe negotiate with both sides. So how do you see this kind of going for Iran?
Yeah, no, great question. I think first and foremost, we need to address Iran's red lines. And Iran's red line here is that Iran will not accept any change within the regional borders, especially for borders that touch Iran, right? Because that's bad for business. Iran has worked tremendously to establish the various economic corridors, around the region, and any type of war is going to disrupt that, right? It's going to disrupt the cash flow, and also it's just going to disrupt civil society, because Iran's already subjected, taking care of like millions and millions and millions of Afghan refugees, right? It's also taken in loads of Iraqi refugees. It's taken in refugees from everywhere, and the last thing it needs is another border crisis, which is going to lead to millions of more people coming into Iran, and then being a drain on its political system, on its resources, to which Iranians are some of the most hospitable people you will meet, right? But the one thing you need to understand is that resources are finite, right? Especially when you're one of the most tremendously sanctioned countries in the world, if not like the most sanctioned country. And so first and foremost, I think Iran will not accept any type of border war on its territory. Second, Azerbaijan, this is my very personal political opinion, maybe even religious opinion, but Azerbaijan can have the moon and the crescent on its flag. It can claim to be Muslim, but at the end of the day, they're serving Western imperialism. They're very close to the Zionist state. In fact, I don't know I think you posted this actually, but they were celebrating with the Azerbaijani flag next to the Israeli flag, and so I think that just basically shows you kind of Azerbaijan's orientation and their role in the current state of affairs. So I think it's important. Armenia is like primarily Christian, right? Orthodox Christian, and so I think it's perfectly reasonable for Iran to take its specific actions right now. I think it really I don't think it really comes down to religious preference. I think it comes down to stability.
Yes, I think stability is definitely very important. When just before we went on, we had the news coming out that effectively Nagorno-Karabakh, Artsakh has completely capitulated. So the Azerbaijanis have won the war. It's been going on and off since 1988. Been a long time, but they've won. But I would have to ask, what do you think here the goal of the United States is? Because on the one hand, they pretend to be Armenia's best friend, talking and sponsoring movies where Oscar Isaac plays a journalist uncovering the crime, and Christian Bale's also in it, I think, uncovering the crimes of the Armenian genocide. And then on the other hand, is cheering through articles in the Atlantic Council about Armenians getting slaughtered in the 2020 war. What's the game here?
Yeah, I think that could easily be answered by soft power influence. If you convince a bunch of, Armenians that America has your back, America helped save you out of this very tumultuous situation with, something that was bound to happen, but with the less amount of bloodshed as possible. But also, Armenians are cool with Russia, they're cool with Iran. If America is able to kind of change Armenia's orientation towards both of those countries, two extremely hostile countries to the United States, then at the end of the day, America doesn't have to fire a single bullet. It's captured the hearts and minds of a bunch of people. And actually, it doesn't even really necessarily need to capture the minds of the majority of people. It just needs to capture the minds and convince the people, in the ruling class of Armenia and the political class of Armenia, that it has its back, and you'll get all these security guarantees, and we'll even write you a check if you do as we say.
Yeah, but then one also has to think about that element of soft power. What do you think would motivate people to ascribe to this? Because effectively, especially as events have unfolded the way they have, it is please offer up a blood sacrifice so that we can let you into our inner social group, and so it'll be socially acceptable for us to socialize with you on an elite level. Maybe I'm reading too much into that, but well, what could induce somebody to do that?
I think it's less about what the U.S. has to offer and more about demonization of other countries that could potentially be friendly to Armenia, particularly, again, Iran and Russia. I think, I think there's some bad players also on the ground itself that are kind of blaming Russia for this or saying that they don't want Russia's help. I think, there's some very paid bad actors there that are doing this because I don't know. I think, again, you guys posted this picture where it's like, the country's going into this very tumultuous territory. Why are people in English holding signs that are anti-Russian? It just doesn't make sense. So I think that there's some certain public manipulation happening from bad actors to convince other people that there doesn't even need to be any logic or reason to this. That Russian intervention would be unacceptable, Iranian intervention would be unacceptable, and that the framing of this would be that it's a very pro-America framing of it.
If we have a bit more time, and if you're okay with it, Chebu, I was hoping to ask a bit about the what.
Go. Yeah, the what.
Okay. Yes, the what in this question, of course, being the big event that often people are drawn to, the Iran-Iraq war. So what would you say, in your opinion, is the biggest misconception that you often have to deal with about the Iran-Iraq war?
Yeah, I mean, we refer to it as the imposed war because it was actually, imposed on Iran with the blessings of, might I say, the United States and the Soviet Union. And I think, actually, let me just hop on the soapbox here. When it comes to misconceptions, I think, a lot of Westerners say about Iran that, it's just the octave. They try to put Iran into a box and they say, why doesn't Iran have this pro-socialist view and things like that? I think the Iran-Iraq war proves, well, at least left a very bad taste to what I would say the Trotskyist communists are capable of domestically, and what the USSR did in its hand with arming Saddam Hussein. Because on one hand, you have the USSR, actively arming Saddam Hussein, right? They're giving him MiGs, they're giving him, all this entire arsenal. On the second hand, you have terrorist organizations that call themselves communists at the time, right? Like the Mujahideen al-Khalq, for example, who actually helped actually fight on behalf of Saddam's regime. They carried out massive terrorist attacks inside Iran, and these were people that flew the hammer and sickle. They had the hammer and sickle on their logo, and so I think the Iran-Iraq war was a huge point in where a lot of Iranians actually became hostile to the idea of communism, to the point where, Imam Khomeini actually wrote a letter. I don't know if you know about the letter to Gorbachev saying, hey, the USSR is about to collapse. The only way you can save your country is through Islam. And so I think a lot of Westerners need to realize that the only reason that Iranians are so hostile to the left wing, whether that's socialism, whether you call that communism, or just left wing ideas in general, anything that's associated to that, is because of the imposed war. I'm actually glad you brought that up because it is Holy Defense Week. I believe that starts tomorrow, which is the marking of
right, because
the what event.
The Iraqis invaded around this time. One of the things that I think is also interesting, I don't know if you've kept track of it, but the historiography around that has begun to shift into a more nuanced direction. So a few years ago, I read a book by a French, of all things, a French Ministry of Defense official, Pierre Razou, about the Iran-Iraq war. It's been translated into English, and unlike in previous accounts that I've seen, where it's all about the Iraqis and what Saddam is doing and how the Iraqis are going to deal with a certain problem, he actually discusses a lot what the Iranians were thinking and doing, and Iranian politics. And one of the things he also discusses is how on the way it was normally portrayed, particularly at the time, was there is Ayatollah Khomeini and Iranian politics is a black box that we don't discuss, whereas he actually talks about how prime ministers are coming and going in Tehran throughout the war, and they're dealing with, I wonder if you would say this was accurate, a problem of how do we prosecute this war with ever diminishing resources as we get strangled.
Sorry, I'm not sure if I. So, are you asking me to comment on why that was happening?
No, not why that was the case, but if you would say that this would be a perhaps closer reflection of reality about what was going on in Iran than the stereotype, they just threw bodies at the problem.
No, I actually think I don't think that's necessarily the case. Maybe that's the case among some of maybe the owner class, maybe like the more corporate class that was in Iran. I think the end point of the Iran war was actually very ideologically motivated with the actual Islamic Revolution. I actually do have a book recommendation I'm going to post in the chat. The very famous slogan in Iran that was actually conceptualized in the Iran-Iraq war is that the path to Jerusalem is through Karbala. Karbala being, again, a very holy city in Shia Islam. And so they actually tied the Iraq war, and the sole motivator for that for some time was actually the fact that, on day one of the Islamic Revolution, they declared the liberation of Palestine to be one of their primary goals, right? And so with that, you have this dictator, Saddam Hussein, who's actually acting on the behest of the United States, who's the primary backer of the Zionists, who's also, in line with England's demands, who's also established the Zionist state. And so what they saw was there's this puppet dictator that is actually blocking progress, despite Saddam Hussein saying he's doing this and that for Palestine. But we all know at the end of the day, he didn't really do much. There was, the various wars that Iraq engaged with Israel. So I'm not going to discount the bodies being thrown at that. But at the end of the day, Saddam capitulated. Iran declared itself, to be the leading cause for Palestine outside of Palestine itself. All this to say that I think there was a huge ideological factor that coincides with the Islamic Revolution as to why the war needed to be carried out. And I think I forgot the number of the flight. I think the downing of the flight was basically of the Iranian civil airliner was basically America's way of saying, we're not going to let you win this war. We're not going to let this war go on. You need to stop this right now.
I think what happened, well, obviously that's a bit of a contention there, because at least, the U.S. was quite schizophrenic on what happened there, but the official line that eventually emerged is that the captain of the Vincennes was far too eager to engage and not eager enough to actually show discipline, because as you probably know better than most of our listeners, what they did is that they ended up confabulating a story, or trying to, for about a year before having to admit that someone had made a very, very terrible mistake. I think, though, from how I read it, and certainly from all the sources that I read, including one that was actually a book written in 1990, which is that it was less that was a signal, and a lot more what it showed that it didn't stop or discourage the Americans for very long, is that they wanted to signal that irrespective that we've done this very bad thing, we're not going to stop or pull back. It didn't cause them to freak out and say, oh my God.
Sorry, can you repeat that one more time? You kind of cut off the last 10 seconds.
Oh, no, simply that the downing of the airline by the Vincennes, I think the important thing there from the reading that I have done is that it showed that the United States had decided that they were not going to stop. It didn't cause them to stop or freeze or pull back of like, oh my goodness, this is getting out of control. So yes,
yeah.
they came in effectively on the war on Saddam's side. I mean, the Iraqi Air Force even hit the USS Stark with an exocet, and Saddam got to do what almost nobody else gets to do to the United States, which is say, I know I hit your ship and killed 37 of your sailors, but sorry, accidents happen. And the U.S. said, that's okay, Saddam. We know accidents happen.
I think as far as the orientation for the U.S. for that war goes, I think, no one declared it better than, I think Rumsfeld said this, where when asked about, what their position is on the Iran-Iraq war, I think it was Rumsfeld. It was either Rumsfeld or Kissinger that said that I hope they both kill each other. And you can see this too with like, the Contras, right? Where, Iran was given XYZ amount of resources, which essentially helped them keep the war going, right? And all at the same time, I mean, the United States was very open about the support for Saddam, right? They were very open about, the weapons transfers. The Soviet Union was also, I think the Soviet Union was less open about it, but, if you look at any of the posters from the Holy Defense, as it's called, from that era, you'll notice that, there's anti-Soviet and anti-American, imagery, right? Because that's exactly what was happening. The Iranian people were well aware about who was funding their enemy. It was the Soviet Union and it was the United States. And so with that being said, I think the United States was a little bit more overt about it than the Soviet Union, but it just goes to show that, the policy of destabilization through the United States arming of both Iran and Iraq, I mean, we could see that to this day. And I think we can even see that right now as we speak around Iran's borders.
So before we run out of time, I do want the episode is about the Iranian Revolution. So we know about the Iranian Revolution starting in, well, I guess with Mossadegh, really, but where does the Iranian Revolution go now? 2023 and forward? Like, what are the next steps? Are we focusing now back? Because Iran has made deals with South Africa, Saudi, and Venezuela. Do they focus on Palestine? Do they move into the Levant more strongly? Or what's next for Iran? I know that they've gotten they've gotten so many drone contracts that they have to decline some, but in terms of geopolitically, what happens next?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of factors here throughout various different types of contexts. But what I will say is this: I think that Iran's revolution doesn't end until all bad actors are expelled from the region. I think until Muslims, and I will say this, Muslims, I'm not going to generalize this to nations. I will say until Muslims in that entire region have full sovereignty and they have expelled all Western invaders, I don't think that Iran's going to rest. I think that very much aligns with the ideology of Iran's revolution. As far as geopolitics goes and just regional influence, there's a lot to be done now, right? I think we have to see what goes on between Iran's trades with BRICS, what can be developed there. I think January 1st, as the official membership starts, I think we can expect a lot when it comes to trade, specifically, the Belt and Road Initiative, how that kind of coincides with even, complementing the SCO. There's also, ongoing deals between Pakistan and Iran and a gas pipeline that's going to further strengthen the region. There's also, railways being built between Iran and Iraq right now that's going to, facilitate trade. I think the main plan for that is to even go as far as Syria and Lebanon. So I think Iran has nowhere to go but up still.
And that's a really positive note. I think we'll end there. Thank you, Shabbir. Thank you so much for joining us. I think we'll have to make this more regular. And JM, if you're still with us, are you?
Yes.
Anything else? Any closing comments from the peanut gallery in Britain?
Nope.
And let our viewers know where they can find you. Go ahead and plug yourself, Shabbir.
I'm at Abolish NATO everywhere. Everywhere being Twitter and Instagram. I got one last thing to say. Shout out to my boy Tanner, who's in the chat. Thanks for joining in. I gotta check out your movie, bro.
Thanks, Tanner. Tanner was really throwing a bunch of comments in the live chat. Thank you so much, Tanner, for joining us. And you can find us everywhere: YouTube, Locals, Substack, Twitter, Telegram. But please, if you have time, please go to our YouTube and like and subscribe. Please, 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 please. And until next time, I don't even remember who this weekend is, but we'll see you guys then. Thank you so much.